Welcome to Boring Nightmares, where we explore the most unbelievable missing persons cases that have baffled investigators and left families searching for answers. If you're new here, please hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss our latest investigations into these mysterious disappearances. Now let's dive into today's incredible case. The night of October 15th, 1983 was supposed to be just another weekend party for 17-year-old Michelle Blackwell. Her friends from Millfield High School were celebrating homecoming weekend at a secluded farmhouse outside of town, the kind of gathering where teenagers could be teenagers without adult supervision. Michelle was popular, smart, and had her whole future mapped out. She was planning to study journalism at the State University in the fall. She had dreams of becoming an investigative reporter, someone who uncovered the truth no matter how deeply buried it was. But that October night would become her story, one that wouldn't be told for 15 long years. Michelle arrived at the party around 8:30 in her father's borrowed Honda Civic. She wore her favorite denim jacket over a white sweater, dark jeans, and the silver bracelet her grandmother had given her for her 17th birthday just 3 months earlier. Friends remember her laughing and talking about her college applications, excited about the interviews she had scheduled the following week. She was careful about drinking, designated as the driver for her best friend Sarah, who had been looking forward to letting loose after a stressful week of midterm exams. The party was exactly what you'd expect from a gathering of suburban teenagers in 1983. Someone had brought a boombox playing the latest hits from MTV. Groups clustered around the bonfire in the backyard. Couples disappeared into the shadows, and the inevitable drama of teenage social dynamics played out in whispered conversations and meaningful glances. Michelle moved easily between different groups. She was one of those rare people who could talk to anyone, from the quiet theater kids to the star athletes. Around 10:30, something shifted in the evening's atmosphere. Several witnesses later told police they noticed Michelle talking intensely with someone near the edge of the property, away from the main gathering. The lighting was poor in that area, just the distant glow from the bonfire, so descriptions were vague and conflicting. Some said she was with a male figure, others weren't sure. What everyone agreed on was that Michelle seemed engaged in the conversation, not distressed or frightened. Sarah, who had been Michelle's best friend since elementary school, was the first to notice something was wrong. By 11:15, she couldn't find Michelle anywhere. She checked the bathroom, walked around the entire property, even looked in cars thinking maybe Michelle was taking a nap or having a private conversation. Sarah's concern grew when she found Michelle's purse sitting on a picnic table near the house, her car keys still inside. The party was winding down, and Sarah wasn't the only one looking for Michelle. Other friends joined the search, calling her name, checking every possible hiding spot. Someone suggested she might have gone for a walk to clear her head. Michelle was known for taking long walks when she needed to think. But 15 minutes stretched to 30, then to an hour. By midnight, the remaining partygoers were genuinely worried. They decided to drive the rural roads around the farmhouse, thinking maybe Michelle had decided to walk back to town for some reason, though that would have been completely out of character. The roads were dark and winding, lined with dense woods and the occasional farm. Their headlights swept across empty pavement, fence rows, and the black mouths of dirt roads leading deeper into the countryside. At 12:45 a.m., Sarah finally called the police from the farmhouse phone. The responding officer, Deputy Charles Morrison, arrived to find a group of anxious teenagers and conflicting stories about the last time anyone had seen Michelle. Some said 10:30, others insisted it was closer to 11. The descriptions of who she might have been talking to varied wildly, from a tall man in a dark jacket to someone who might have been another student from school. Deputy Morrison took the missing person report seriously, despite the tendency of many officers at the time to assume teenage disappearances were runaways or kids sleeping off too much alcohol somewhere. Michelle didn't fit the profile of a runaway. Her relationship with her parents was good. She had no history of rebellious behavior, and she was genuinely excited about her future plans. More importantly, all her personal belongings were still at the scene, including her purse, keys, and the jacket she'd been wearing when friends last saw her. The initial search focused on the immediate area around the farmhouse. Officers used flashlights to examine the wooded areas, thinking Michelle might have fallen or become injured during a nighttime walk. They checked abandoned buildings, farm equipment, and even dragged a small pond about half a mile from the party location. But as the sun rose on October 16th, there was no trace of Michelle Blackwell anywhere. News of Michelle's disappearance spread quickly through Millfield, a town small enough that everyone knew everyone else's business. Her parents, Robert and Linda Blackwell, were well-respected members of the community. Robert managed the local hardware store, and Linda taught third grade at the elementary school. They were the kind of family that neighbors turned to in times of trouble, known for their generosity and stability. The community response was immediate and overwhelming. Volunteers organized search parties that combed every inch of the countryside within a 5-mile radius of the farmhouse. Flyers with Michelle's photograph appeared in every store window, on telephone poles, and taped to car windshields. Local businesses donated food and supplies for the searchers, and the high school organized prayer vigils and fundraising drives to support the search efforts. Days turned into weeks, and still nothing. The investigation expanded to include state authorities and even brought in specialist search dogs trained to track human scent. The dogs picked up Michelle's trail, leading away from the farmhouse toward the main road, but the scent disappeared at the pavement, suggesting she had gotten into a vehicle at that point. Investigators interviewed everyone who had been at the party, some multiple times, looking for any detail that might have been forgotten or overlooked. They constructed a timeline of the evening, mapping out who was where and when, but the crucial period between 10:30 and 11 remained frustratingly unclear. The person Michelle had been seen talking to became the focus of intense speculation, but no one could provide a clear enough description to generate a useful lead. The case consumed the Blackwell family. Robert took a leave of absence from work to coordinate search efforts and follow up on tips that came in from across the state. Linda continued teaching, finding solace in her routine with the children, but everyone could see the strain wearing on her. Michelle's younger brother David, only 14 at the time, struggled with guilt over the last conversation he'd had with his sister, a typical sibling argument about borrowing clothes that now seemed impossibly trivial. As weeks became months, the intense daily search efforts gradually scaled back, but the family never stopped hoping. Robert developed a system for tracking and following up on every tip, no matter how far-fetched. Linda wrote letters to missing persons, organizations, and true crime television shows, hoping to keep Michelle's case in the public eye. They attended vigils for other missing children, joining a community of families united by their shared nightmare of uncertainty. The first year was the hardest. Every holiday, every birthday, every milestone that Michelle should have been part of became a sharp reminder of her absence. The family struggled with when and how to move forward with their lives while still holding on to hope. Do you keep her bedroom exactly as she left it? Do you cancel the college plans and lose the deposits? How do you live with not knowing? The investigation continued, but leads became increasingly rare and less promising. There were reported sightings of Michelle in other towns, other states, but none ever panned out. A few tips suggested she had been seen with mysterious figures, but these stories were too vague and contradictory to pursue effectively. The case gradually faded from daily conversations in Millfield, though it never entirely disappeared from people's minds. Detective Frank Sullivan inherited the case when the original investigating officer retired in 1987. Sullivan brought fresh eyes to the evidence, but also had to acknowledge the reality that after 4 years, the chances of finding Michelle alive were virtually non-existent. The case was officially reclassified as a presumed homicide, though without a body or clear evidence of foul play, there was little to pursue. The Blackwell family adapted to their new reality as best they could. Robert eventually returned to work full-time, throwing himself into community activities and youth programs. Linda became an activist for missing persons cases, working with other families and lobbying for better resources and coordination between law enforcement agencies. David graduated high school and left for college, carrying the complicated mixture of survivor's guilt and determination to live the life his sister never got to experience. But small towns have long memories, and Michelle's disappearance remained an open wound in Millfield's collective consciousness. New residents would eventually learn the story, usually from neighbors who would point out the Blackwell house and recount the mystery of the girl who vanished from a party 15 years ago. Local teenagers continued to whisper about the case, turning it into a cautionary tale about the dangers of going to parties in isolated locations. The case might have remained forever unsolved, just another entry in the files of missing persons who disappeared without explanation. But sometimes, completely by accident, the earth gives up its secrets. In the spring of 1998, construction began on a new shopping center on the outskirts of Millfield, about 3 miles from where the party had taken place 15 years earlier. The land had been farmland for generations, owned by the Morrison family, who had finally decided to sell to developers as the town slowly expanded outward. It was considered prime commercial real estate, with good highway access and room for the kind of big box stores that were transforming small-town America. The construction crew from Hartwell Development was experienced in site preparation, used to dealing with the surprises that came with breaking ground on previously undeveloped land. Old farm equipment, forgotten septic systems, unmarked graves from pioneer families. They'd seen it all. But on the morning of May 14th, 1998, heavy equipment operator Tom Kemp uncovered something that stopped work immediately. His excavator bucket brought up what looked like fabric and something white that gleamed in the morning sunlight. Kemp shut down his machine and called over the site foreman, Jerry Walsh. Both men had enough experience to recognize what they were looking at, even before they saw the silver bracelet tangled in the decayed remains of a denim jacket. The coroner's preliminary examination told the story that everyone feared. The remains had been there for a significant period of time, possibly years, buried in the earth before being disturbed by the construction equipment. The silver bracelet, tarnished but still recognizable, matched the description her grandmother had given to police 15 years earlier. The fragments of denim were consistent with the jacket Michelle had been wearing the night she disappeared. DNA technology had advanced dramatically since 1983, revolutionizing forensic science and enabling investigators to solve cases that had remained cold for decades. What would have been impossible to determine in the original investigation could now provide definitive answers through genetic analysis. The remains were carefully transported to the State Forensic Laboratory, where anthropologists and DNA specialists would work to confirm what everyone already suspected. The news hit Millfield like a thunderbolt. After 15 years of wondering, of hoping against hope, of constructing elaborate theories about what might have happened, the community finally had an answer. But it wasn't the answer anyone had wanted. The discovery site was immediately cordoned off as investigators expanded their search of the area, looking for additional evidence that might explain how Michelle had ended up buried 3 miles from where she had last been seen. Robert and Linda Blackwell received the call they had been both dreading and hoping for since that October night in 1983. Detective Sullivan, who had inherited the case years earlier, delivered the news with as much compassion as 15 years of police work allowed. The remains found at the construction site appeared to match their daughter's description and personal effects. They would need to provide DNA samples for comparison, but the preliminary evidence strongly suggested that Michelle had finally been found. The construction site became the center of intense investigative activity. Forensic archaeologists joined the investigation, bringing specialized techniques for carefully recovering evidence from burial sites while preserving the integrity of potential clues. Every grain of soil was sifted, every fragment cataloged. The location itself raised disturbing questions. This wasn't a random dumping ground or a place where someone might accidentally end up. The burial site showed signs of deliberate concealment, suggesting that whoever had brought Michelle here had planned to ensure she would never be found. DNA analysis would play a crucial role in the identification process, using advanced techniques to compare genetic material from the remains with samples from Michelle's family members. But even as the scientific process moved forward, investigators were already pursuing leads based on the discovery. Who had access to this land in 1983? What had changed between then and now that allowed the construction to proceed in this location? The property records showed the land had been agricultural, owned by the same family for generations until the recent sale to developers. The media attention was immediate and intense. News vans lined the construction site perimeter, reporters updating the story hourly as developments emerged. The case that had captured local attention 15 years earlier was now national news. True crime enthusiasts flooded social media with theories and speculation. Family members who had spent years managing their grief in private suddenly found themselves thrust back into the spotlight, forced to relive their worst nightmare in front of cameras and microphones. The popularity of true crime coverage had raised public interest in unsolved mysteries, encouraging citizens to come forward with information that might help bring closure to victims' families. Tips began pouring into the police department, some credible, others clearly the product of overactive imaginations fueled by media coverage. Each lead had to be investigated, adding to the workload of detectives who were already working around the clock to process the crime scene and follow up on legitimate investigative avenues. The forensic anthropologist's preliminary report provided crucial details about the remains. The skeletal analysis confirmed that the victim was a young female, consistent with Michelle's age at the time of her disappearance. Evidence of trauma suggested this had not been a natural death, though the specific cause would require additional analysis. The positioning of the remains and the condition of the burial site indicated the body had been deliberately interred shortly after death, not moved to this location later. Sarah Thompson, Michelle's best friend from high school, now married with children of her own, found herself confronting memories she had buried for 15 years. The guilt she had carried since that night, wondering if she should have insisted on staying together, wondering if she could have prevented whatever happened, came flooding back with renewed intensity. She had built a life despite the tragedy, but the discovery of Michelle's remains forced her to acknowledge that part of her had never really moved on. The investigation took on new urgency as detectives worked to establish a timeline of events that had led to Michelle's death and burial. The construction site was only 3 miles from the farmhouse where the party had taken place, but it was in the opposite direction from Michelle's intended route home. This suggested that either she had gone there willingly with someone she trusted, or she had been taken there against her will. Either scenario pointed to someone with local knowledge, someone who knew the area well enough to choose a burial site that would remain undisturbed for 15 years. Cold case units across the country had been established specifically to tackle long unsolved cases, using advances in forensic science and investigative techniques to bring closure to families and justice for victims. Detective Sullivan reached out to specialists who had experience with similar cases, consulting on best practices for investigations that spanned decades. The original evidence from 1983 was re-examined using modern techniques, looking for clues that might have been missed or were impossible to detect with the technology available at the time. The small farming community where Michelle's remains were discovered found itself under intense scrutiny. Residents who had lived there for decades were interviewed about their memories of the early 1980s, about any unusual activity they might have noticed, about strangers who might have been in the area. The property had been relatively isolated in 1983, accessed by a dirt road that was rarely traveled except by the farming family who owned it. Someone had to have known the area intimately to choose it as a burial site. David Blackwell, Michelle's younger brother, was now in his 30s with a family of his own. The news of the discovery brought back all the complicated emotions of his teenage years, the survivor's guilt, and the burden of being the child who lived while his parents focused their energy on searching for the child who was missing. He had never spoken publicly about his sister's disappearance, but the discovery of her remains changed everything. The case was no longer about finding Michelle. It was about finding who had killed her and why. The forensic analysis continued for weeks as specialists worked to extract every possible piece of information from the remains and the burial site. Advanced techniques, like stable isotope analysis, could provide details about where Michelle had lived and what she had eaten in the months before her death, potentially offering clues about her activities during that final night. Every thread of fabric, every trace of organic material, every grain of soil was analyzed for evidence that might point toward her killer. As the investigation progressed, a grim picture began to emerge. This had not been a crime of opportunity or a random act of violence. The careful burial, the remote location, the fact that Michelle's body had remained hidden for 15 years, all pointed to someone who had planned carefully and executed methodically. Someone who understood that time was the enemy of justice, that evidence would degrade and memories would fade. Someone who had been confident that Michelle Blackwell would never be found. But they had not counted on the relentless march of development, on a construction project that would finally disturb the carefully chosen grave. They had not anticipated the advances in forensic science that would allow investigators to extract evidence from remains that had been buried for 15 years, and they certainly had not expected that a community's determination to find answers would never truly fade, even after a decade and a half of silence. The discovery at the construction site marked the end of one mystery and the beginning of another. Michelle Blackwell had finally been found, but the question of who had killed her and why remained as compelling as ever. The investigation that had begun in 1983 was about to enter its most crucial phase, armed with new evidence and driven by the knowledge that somewhere out there, Michelle's killer had been living with their secret for 15 long years. The construction site would remain closed for weeks as investigators continued their painstaking work, but the machinery that had uncovered Michelle's remains had already done its job. As the reality of the discovery settled over Millfield, the investigation took on dimensions that no one had anticipated 15 years earlier. The small construction site became the epicenter of what would prove to be one of the most complex forensic investigations in the region's history. Advances in DNA technology have enabled investigators to identify the perpetrators of murders, rapes, and other crimes that had remained unsolved for decades, and advances in DNA technologies have substantially increased the successful DNA analysis of age-degraded, limited, or otherwise compromised biological evidence. The forensic team working at the site represented the cutting edge of modern investigative science. Crime scene samples once thought to be unsuitable for testing may now yield DNA profiles, and samples that previously generated inconclusive DNA results may now be successfully analyzed. What would have been impossible to determine from Michelle's remains in 1983 could now provide investigators with detailed information about her final hours, her killer, and the circumstances surrounding her death. The DNA comparison process began immediately. Samples from Michelle's parents were fast-tracked through the system, but even with modern technology, the process would take weeks to complete. Meanwhile, investigators worked to extract every possible piece of information from the burial site itself. Soil samples were analyzed for traces of accelerants, chemicals, or other foreign substances that might provide clues about who had brought Michelle to this location and when. The advanced forensic techniques available in 1998 included methods that seemed like science fiction compared to what had been available during the original investigation. Forensic anthropologists could determine not just cause of death, but also information about the victim's activities in the days before death, their general health, and even details about their diet and lifestyle. Every bone fragment was cataloged and analyzed, every thread of fabric examined under high-powered microscopes. Detective Sullivan coordinated with specialists from the State Crime Lab, bringing in experts in forensic archaeology who had experience with cases where remains had been buried for extended periods. These specialists understood how to read the subtle signs left by decomposition, how environmental factors affected the preservation of evidence, and most importantly, how to distinguish between natural processes and human intervention in the burial process. The crime scene itself told a story that became clearer with each passing day of investigation. The depth and positioning of the remains suggested that whoever buried Michelle had taken time to conceal the grave properly. This wasn't a hasty disposal of evidence, but a carefully planned interment designed to ensure the body would never be found. The location, 3 miles from where Michelle had last been seen, indicated either local knowledge or careful scouting of potential burial sites. Media attention intensified as news organizations from across the country picked up the story. The case had all the elements that captivated public attention. A teenage victim with a bright future, a decades-long mystery, and the promise of finally solving a case that had haunted a community for 15 years. Television news trucks lined the streets around the construction site, while reporters interviewed anyone with connections to the original investigation or memories of Michelle's disappearance. The renewed attention brought both benefits and complications to the investigation. Tips began pouring in from people who claimed to have information about the night Michelle disappeared, some credible, others clearly the product of overactive imaginations influenced by media coverage. Each tip had to be investigated, adding to the workload of detectives who were already working around the clock to process the physical evidence from the burial site. Among the most promising leads were reports from people who had lived in the area during the 1980s and remembered unusual activity around the time of Michelle's disappearance. Several residents recalled seeing unfamiliar vehicles on the rural roads that connected the construction site to the main highway, though their memories of events from 15 years earlier were understandably hazy and sometimes contradictory. The investigation also benefited from technological advances in areas beyond DNA analysis. Geographic information systems allowed investigators to map the area as it had existed in 1983, identifying all the access routes to the burial site and cross-referencing them with known locations of interest from the original investigation. Satellite imagery, though not available for 1983, could show how the landscape had changed over the years and help investigators understand why this particular location had been chosen. Forensic entomology, The study of insects in criminal investigations provided additional clues about the timing of Michelle's burial. Even after 15 years, certain insect evidence remained in the soil around the gravesite, offering information about the season when the body had been interred and the environmental conditions at the time. This scientific approach to analyzing decomposition helped narrow down not just when Michelle had died, but when she had been buried, potentially distinguishing between immediate burial and a body that might have been stored elsewhere before being brought to this location. The community's response to the discovery was complex and deeply emotional. For some residents, the finding of Michelle's remains brought a sense of closure that had been missing for 15 years. The uncertainty that had hung over Millfield like a cloud was finally being lifted, replaced by the hard reality of evidence and investigation. But for others, the discovery raised new fears and questions about safety and trust within their community. Neighbors began to look at each other differently, wondering who among them might have been harboring such a terrible secret for 15 years. The realization that Michelle's killer had likely been living among them all this time, attending community events, shopping in local stores, and perhaps even participating in the searches for her, created an atmosphere of suspicion and unease that was difficult to shake. The Blackwell family found themselves once again thrust into the center of a media storm, forced to relive their nightmare in front of cameras and reporters. Robert Blackwell, now grayer and more worn than he had been 15 years earlier, spoke to the media with the measured words of someone who had learned to manage his grief in public. Linda Blackwell, who had become an advocate for missing persons cases, used her experience to help other families while processing her own renewed trauma. David Blackwell, Michelle's younger brother, was now in his 30s with a family of his own. The discovery of his sister's remains forced him to confront emotions he had buried for years, the complicated mixture of relief at finally knowing what had happened and renewed grief at the confirmation that Michelle was truly gone. The little boy who had argued with his sister about borrowing clothes was now a man trying to explain to his own children why their Aunt Michelle wasn't coming to family gatherings. As the forensic investigation continued, investigators began to piece together a timeline of events that painted a disturbing picture of Michelle's final hours. The condition of the remains and the burial site suggested that Michelle had been killed shortly after her disappearance, contradicting any theories that she might have been held captive for an extended period. The careful burial indicated planning and local knowledge, supporting the theory that her killer was someone familiar with the area. The investigation team expanded to include specialists in criminal psychology who began developing a profile of Michelle's killer based on the evidence from the burial site and the circumstances of her disappearance. The profile suggested someone with local knowledge, possibly someone who had interacted with Michelle before the night she disappeared, and someone capable of the kind of long-term deception required to live with such a secret for 15 years. Meanwhile, the original evidence from 1983 was being re-examined using modern techniques. Photographs from the party were enhanced and analyzed for faces that might not have been clearly visible in the original investigation. Witness statements were compared using computer analysis to identify consistencies and discrepancies that might have been missed by human investigators working with limited technology. The forensic laboratory work continued around the clock, with specialists working to extract every possible piece of information from Michelle's remains and the physical evidence from the burial site. Advanced chemical analysis could detect traces of substances that would have been undetectable in 1983, potentially providing clues about where Michelle had been taken after leaving the party and what had happened to her in her final hours. As the investigation entered its third week, the scientific evidence began to paint a clearer picture of the crime, but the identity of Michelle's killer remained elusive. The DNA analysis would provide crucial information, but until those results were available, investigators continued to follow every lead, interview every potential witness, and analyze every piece of physical evidence with the knowledge that they might finally be close to solving one of the region's most infamous cold cases. The construction site remained closed, transformed from a symbol of progress and development into a reminder of tragedy and loss. The investigation team expanded to include criminal profilers and forensic specialists who began constructing a comprehensive psychological profile of Michelle's killer. DNA technology has revolutionized the field of forensic science and enabled the resolution of many chilling cold cases that had remained unsolved for decades by using advanced techniques such as DNA profiling, familial DNA testing, and genetic genealogy. The profile suggested someone with intimate knowledge of the local area, possibly someone who had interacted with Michelle before that fatal night, and someone capable of maintaining a facade of normalcy while harboring such a dark secret for 15 years. The forensic evidence continued to mount as specialists worked around the clock to extract every possible clue from the burial site. Advanced DNA technology techniques can quickly and accurately read many DNA letters at once, making it easier to analyze DNA from small or degraded samples such as human remains. The condition of Michelle's remains, while challenging to analyze after 15 years in the ground, still yielded crucial information about her final hours and the circumstances surrounding her death. Detective Sullivan coordinated with the State Crime Laboratory to ensure that every piece of evidence was processed using the most advanced techniques available. With the increasing use of DNA analysis, cold cases are being solved faster than ever, as modern advances in DNA technology mean that police can now solve the most long-term murder cases. The investigation had access to technologies that were unimaginable in 1983, tools that could extract genetic profiles from evidence that would have been considered unusable during the original investigation. The media attention surrounding the case intensified as news of the advanced forensic techniques spread. Television crews documented the painstaking process of evidence collection, while forensic experts explained to reporters how forensic DNA technology may be used to solve current and cold cases. The case became a symbol of how persistence and technological advancement could finally bring justice to victims whose cases had gone cold decades earlier. As the scientific analysis continued, investigators began to piece together a more complete picture of what had happened to Michelle on that October night in 1983. The burial site showed clear signs of deliberate concealment, with the killer having taken great care to ensure that Michelle's body would remain hidden. The depth of the grave, the careful positioning of the remains, and the remote location all pointed to someone who had planned meticulously and understood the importance of avoiding detection. The forensic anthropologist's detailed analysis revealed that Michelle's death had occurred shortly after her disappearance, contradicting any theories that she might have been held captive for an extended period. The trauma patterns on her skeletal remains told a story of violence that had ended quickly, suggesting that her killer had acted with decisive brutality rather than prolonged torture. This information helped investigators narrow their timeline and focus their efforts on the crucial hours immediately following Michelle's disappearance from the party. Meanwhile, the investigation into the original evidence from 1983 yielded new insights when examined with modern techniques. Photographs from the party were digitally enhanced, revealing faces in the background that had been unclear in the original prints. Witness statements were analyzed using computer algorithms to identify patterns and inconsistencies that human investigators might have missed. Every piece of evidence was being re-examined through the lens of 15 years of technological advancement. The construction site remained closed as investigators expanded their search radius, looking for additional evidence that might have been scattered over the years. Ground-penetrating radar was brought in to scan the surrounding area for any other disturbed soil that might indicate additional burial sites or hidden evidence. The investigation was leaving no stone unturned, driven by the knowledge that this might be their only chance to solve Michelle's murder. As the forensic work continued, Detective Sullivan began to focus on the psychological aspects of the case. The careful burial, the remote location, and the 15-year gap between the murder and the discovery all suggested a killer who was capable of long-term planning and exceptional self-control. This wasn't someone who had acted impulsively and then panicked. This was someone who had committed a calculated murder and then successfully hidden the evidence for a decade and a half. The victim impact on the Millfield community was profound and lasting. Michelle's murder had not only taken a young life, but had also shattered the sense of security that residents had taken for granted. Parents who had allowed their teenagers to attend parties in the early 1980s now questioned every decision they had made. The knowledge that a killer had been living among them for 15 years created an atmosphere of suspicion and fear that would take years to overcome. The Blackwell family found themselves, once again, at the center of intense media scrutiny, forced to relive their worst nightmare in front of cameras and reporters. Robert Blackwell, now in his 60s, spoke to the media with the controlled emotion of someone who had learned to manage his grief in public. His determination to find his daughter's killer had never wavered, even during the darkest years when it seemed like Michelle would never be found. Linda Blackwell, who had become a tireless advocate for missing persons cases, used her experience to help other families navigate the complex emotions that came with the discovery of a loved one's remains. Her work with victim advocacy groups had given her a platform to speak about the importance of never giving up hope, even when cases seemed impossible to solve. The discovery of Michelle's remains validated her years of advocacy and demonstrated the importance of persistent investigation. David Blackwell, Michelle's younger brother, struggled with the complex emotions that came with finally knowing what had happened to his sister. The little boy who had argued with Michelle about borrowing clothes was now a man with children of his own, trying to explain to them why their Aunt Michelle would never join them for family gatherings. The discovery brought both closure and renewed grief, forcing him to confront emotions he had buried for 15 years. As the investigation moved into its fourth week, the scientific evidence began to coalesce into a clearer picture of the crime. The DNA analysis would provide crucial information about Michelle's killer, but even without those results, investigators were building a comprehensive understanding of what had happened that October night. The evidence suggested a perpetrator who was organized, methodical, and intimately familiar with the local area. The case had evolved from a missing person investigation into a complex murder inquiry that would test every aspect of modern forensic science. The investigators working on the case understood that they were not just solving a crime, but also providing closure to a family that had waited 15 years for answers. The pressure was enormous, but so was the determination to ensure that Michelle Blackwell's killer would finally be held accountable for his actions. The discovery of Michelle's remains had transformed the investigation from a cold case into an active murder inquiry with unlimited resources and the full support of the district attorney's office. The case had become a priority not just for the investigators involved, but for the entire criminal justice system. The construction workers' discovery had set in motion the most sophisticated forensic investigation in the region's history. With the increasing use of DNA analysis, cold cases are being solved faster than ever, as modern advances in DNA technology mean that police can now solve the most long-term murder cases and overturn wrongful convictions. DNA technology has advanced to make it easier to analyze DNA from small or degraded samples, such as human remains. The forensic anthropologist brought in to examine Michelle's remains represented the cutting edge of modern investigative science. In recent years, considerable progress in the field of forensic science have occurred, causing the reopening investigation of old unsolved murders, called cold cases, especially when findings can still be analyzed and reanalyzed, taken into account new technologies and new scientific methodologies. It also allows the reopening and solution of many unsolved cases as new analysis of findings taken from the crime scene can be performed. The State Crime Laboratory had been transformed since 1983, where once a single DNA sample might have taken weeks to process and could only be extracted from fresh, high-quality biological material, new techniques can quickly and accurately read many DNA letters at once, making it easier to analyze DNA from small or degraded samples such as human remains. The advanced extraction methods available in 1998 could recover genetic profiles from evidence that would have been considered worthless 15 years earlier. Detective Sullivan worked closely with the state's Forensic Genealogy Unit, a division that hadn't existed when Michelle first disappeared. By using advanced techniques such as DNA profiling, familial DNA testing, and genetic genealogy, investigators have been able to identify suspects, confirm their involvement in crimes, and bring them to justice. The DNA comparison process began with samples from Michelle's parents, but the investigation had expanded far beyond simple identification. The forensic team was using the most advanced techniques available, methods that could potentially provide information about Michelle's killer, even from severely degraded evidence. Forensic DNA analysis has revolutionized criminal investigations, providing law enforcement with a powerful tool to identify suspects, exonerate the innocent, and solve cold cases. The continued advancement of DNA technologies, including next-generation sequencing, AI-driven analysis, and mobile DNA platforms, has further expanded the capabilities of forensic scientists. These innovations enable the rapid, accurate, and efficient processing of evidence, bringing new levels of precision to criminal investigations. The investigation had also benefited from advances in database technology. The Combined DNA Index System, or CODIS, had grown exponentially since the mid-1990s, containing genetic profiles from convicted offenders across the country. If Michelle's killer had committed other crimes, if he had been arrested for any felony since the establishment of mandatory DNA collection laws, his profile would be in the system waiting to be matched. But even as the scientific analysis continued, investigators were pursuing more traditional leads with renewed vigor. The construction site had been thoroughly documented using ground-penetrating radar and three-dimensional mapping technology that could reveal any additional burial sites or hidden evidence. Every grain of soil had been sifted through mesh screens, every fragment of material cataloged and analyzed. The media attention surrounding the case had generated hundreds of new tips, some promising, others clearly the product of overactive imaginations. The popularity of true crime books, TV series, and podcasts has raised public interest in unsolved mysteries, encouraging citizens to submit any additional evidence or tips that could help bring closure and justice to victims' families. Detective Sullivan and his team worked around the clock to follow up on every credible lead, knowing that even the smallest detail might provide the breakthrough they needed. The psychological profile of Michelle's killer had been refined using modern criminal profiling techniques. The careful burial, the remote location, and the 15-year concealment all suggested someone with intimate knowledge of the area and the emotional detachment necessary to live with such a secret for so long. The killer had likely continued to live in the community, attending local events, shopping in stores where Michelle's missing person flyers had once hung, perhaps even participating in the search efforts. As the investigation entered its second month, the forensic evidence began to paint a clearer picture of the crime. The positioning of Michelle's remains suggested she had been killed shortly after her disappearance, contradicting theories that she might have been held captive. The condition of her bones revealed evidence of trauma that supported the conclusion that this had been a violent death, not an accident or natural causes. The burial site itself told a story of premeditation and planning. The depth of the grave, the careful positioning of the remains, and the choice of location all indicated that Michelle's killer had taken time to ensure she would never be found. This wasn't a panic burial or a hasty disposal of evidence, but a methodical interment designed to keep the secret forever hidden. But the killer had made one crucial miscalculation. He had assumed that the remote location would remain undisturbed forever, that the march of development would never reach the carefully chosen grave site. He had not anticipated that technology would advance to the point where even severely degraded remains could yield crucial evidence. Most importantly, he had underestimated the determination of a community and a family that would never stop searching for answers. The investigation was far from over, but the discovery of Michelle's remains had fundamentally changed the nature of the case. This was no longer a missing person investigation haunted by uncertainty and false hope. This was a homicide case with physical evidence, scientific analysis, and the full resources of modern forensic investigation. Detective Sullivan knew that somewhere in Millfield, Michelle's killer was watching the news reports and reading the newspaper coverage with growing anxiety. For 15 years, he had lived with the secret, confident that Michelle would never be found. Now, with every day that passed, with every piece of evidence analyzed and every witness re-interviewed, the walls were closing in. The construction site that had accidentally uncovered Michelle's grave had become a symbol of justice delayed but not denied. The machinery that had disturbed her carefully hidden resting place had also set in motion a chain of events that would either solve one of the region's most notorious cold cases or add another layer of frustration to a mystery that had already consumed too many lives. As the forensic analysis continued and the investigation expanded, one thing was certain: Michelle Blackwell's story was finally being heard. After 15 years of silence, her voice was speaking through the evidence, through the advanced forensic techniques that could extract truth from degraded remains, and through the unwavering determination of investigators who refused to let her case go cold again. The teenager who had dreamed of becoming an investigative reporter, someone who uncovered the truth, no matter how deeply buried, would finally have her own truth revealed. The only question that remained was whether her killer would be held accountable for a crime that had haunted an entire community for far too long.